Some of my most awkward moments as a pastor have been when you have been in pain. Like times where I was present with the people that I was called to pastor and I didn't know what to say. I remember walking into the house of a young family at our church. This was a while ago, and they had put their infant son in a swing and he never woke up. And just walking in there and not knowing what to do. I remember visiting in the hospital one of our college gals who had come down with this rare disease. She was in the burn unit because she had come down with this disease that literally would burn you from the inside out. And so all of her skin fell off. She went blind. She was wrapped up like a mummy and just didn't know what to do. We maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know, we moved across the street from a family in our church. And soon after, she came down with stage 4 lung cancer. I just remember like the half a dozen times I would walk across the street and I was like an alien walking into like traveling to Earth and just not knowing at all what I was supposed to do in that moment. And some of those part of it is I was so inexperienced, right? I didn't know what I was doing. I was a young pastor and they didn't teach me that at the seminary that I didn't go to, right? I didn't take that class that I didn't, And so some of it was like I was still learning some things, but then a lot of it was that I don't know how to grieve. I don't know how. A few years back, I was a part of this pastor cohort, and for 2 years, we 6 or 7 of us just spent time together and learned some things. And this one time they flew us out to Nashville to meet with this counselor, and he's kind of this counselor to pastors and counselor to leaders, and so we're meeting with him, and he would just do these kind of weird things with us to try to get us in touch with something besides just whiteboards and preaching, right? Just something a little bit below the line, a little bit under the surface, and so he would we had this South African pastor with us named Fricky, right? His name was Fricky. Loved Fricky, and he had Fricky standing on a chair roaring like a lion one time. Right, he had another guy like holding onto a pillow and talking about his deepest feelings, and the pillow represented his heart, right? So he could kind of be in touch with like what he was actually feeling and what he was actually, where his emotions actually were, because none of us knew how to grieve. None of us knew how to feel. And so then it was my turn, and I can't really describe it, but it wasn't super emotional. It was kind of more of a practical leadership exercise. And so we're just kind of all talking, and the other pastors are interacting with me, and I'm kind of interacting with it. And then the counselor guy kind of walks up behind me, a little bit creepy like, and he just kind of, so everybody stops because he's going to say something, and he kind of whispers in my ear, and he says, "You're hurting, aren't you?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't, my wife's not here. She usually tells me if I'm hurting. I don't know if I mean, you're probably right, but I'm not sure." And he said, "Hurt for you is like a speed bump. You don't stop and feel it. You just truck on through." And I wonder if most of us are like that. We don't actually know how to grieve. We never learn. We don't know what it looks like to properly, in a healthy, mature, godly way, actually deal with our pain. But here's what I know for sure we have to learn to. Right? We're going to have to learn to, because what we know for sure is that we're not going to escape suffering and sorrow. That we've all experienced it before, and it's coming again. From the moment that sin entered the world and shattered it, pain has been present and grief has been a primary emotion. It's just been something that humanity has had to learn and walk through, that we have to learn how to grieve. Even God grieves. Right? In Genesis 6, he looks down at the world shattered by sin, sees all the corruption and all the brokenness, and says, "I'm grieved that I made them at all." And there's a complexity to the emotional life of God, and so there's some theology there that we could work through, but in the relational heart of God, he grieved. And we're to learn to grieve. Suffering and grief for God's people never stops in the Bible. From slavery in Egypt to exile and captivity from foreign nations to a Roman cross to the persecution of the church in the New Testament, suffering not only is always present, it's promised. This is just something that we walk through as Christians. It's going to happen. It doesn't go away just because we're a Christian. And so we have to learn how to grieve. And pain comes in many forms. And so we have to learn how to grieve in proportion to the pain. Right? Pain can be anything. Pain can be disappointment in a job or a career. Pain can be betrayal. Pain can be your child's behavior or development. Pain can be physical illness. It could be the death of a loved one. Pain can be relationships with parents, relationships with children, relationships with your spouse, relationships with friends, relationships in the church. It can be loneliness, singleness, infertility, literally anything that happens in a broken world. Anything that shouldn't be, anything that heaven doesn't know is an opportunity for us to grieve and to figure out what do we do with our pain. Injustices in the world, tragedies that happen across the globe, acts of nature, the breaking down of the moral fabric of a culture, we probably should be grieving more than we do. In fact, we should probably be grieving before we do other things, right? So we're on a social media fast as a church. I know all of you have been awesome with it. You've never once accidentally hit Instagram and checked something. It's been perfect, right? So praise be to God for that. But in a month from now, right, or in a couple weeks from now, when we jump back on, if you choose to, our social media posts, like around cultural issues, political issues, racism, abortion, just any kind of argument or debate that's happening in the world, we probably shouldn't be posting those things. We probably should be grieving first those things. Right? Our grieving should be before God, not this litany of grievances before the world. That should be our first action, our first posture that we take. We should be grieving more, and yet we have so many cheap alternatives to what is a godly grief before God. There's so many ways in which we do this that isn't helpful, that isn't healthy, that isn't healing. Right? We run to creation and not to the Creator in our fear and sadness and anger. And when we do that, we put huge burdens on each other, huge burdens on God's things, right? God's stuff, when emotional health and spiritual health is found before God. What do? We numb our pain, right? We try to escape it maybe with substances, food, overworking, TV, entertainment. Sometimes we lash out in anger or bitterness, not knowing what to do with our sadness. But all throughout the Bible, God invites us to true emotional health, spiritual health, by grieving before Him, lamenting to Him. There's a great book, if you struggle with depression or just a general melancholy, there's a great book called Spurgeon's Sorrows by Zach Eswine. But he says this, I love this, he says, "In this fallen world, sadness is an act of sanity, our tears the testimony of the sane." That's good. And so simply my work here today is just to teach us how to lament. I just want to teach us how to grieve. I want you to lament before God this week. Now, when we're talking about being free from pain or the freedom from pain, we're not talking about being free from pain. Right? You're not going to be free from pain today. Okay, now you might go in the back and we'll pray over you and God might heal you from a sickness. So maybe, but in the sense that we are going to face pain in our lives, that's going to happen. You're never going to be free from pain until Jesus comes, right? Until you're with Him and He either kills you or He comes back. That's when you'll be free from pain. But we can have freedom from pain where it doesn't paralyze us. Right, where we don't get stuck in it, where we can find our way through it. We can learn how to do that, and that's through lament and grieving before God. And in the same way that we found freedom from our past last week is the same way you're going to find freedom from your pain this week, and it's simply this, that you have to walk through it with Jesus. We walk through it with Jesus, and the Psalms are the best place to start. God wrote us a book of prayers so that we can pray them back to Him. Right? The Psalms are great, and they cover every range of human emotions, right? Everything you might feel, whether you even know it or not, can be found in the Psalms. Sorrow and joy and betrayal and doubt and guilt and shame and excitement. Praying the Psalms give you words for your soul. If you've been abused, you could pray through Psalm 54, Psalm 55, or 56. If you feel lonely, you could pray through Psalm 25. If you're discouraged, you could pray through Psalm 42. If you need to repent of sin, you can pray through Psalm 51 or Psalm 32. If you need to rest, you can pray through Psalm 23. These are Psalms of lament. And typically, there's a pattern to the Psalms of Lament. So you'll typically have this kind of pattern where you directly address God, right? You're expressing your dependence on him. You're grieving to him, or you're processing with him first. And then you lament. There's a cry for help. You are telling God what's going on. Right? This is what's going on. This is what I need help with. And then there's a confession of sin or a confession of pain. I've sinned in this way, or people have sinned against me and it hurts in this way. And then we move to a petition where we ask God to do something about it. Will you move? Will you help? Will you do something? And then we express some sort of confidence in God's response, that because of his character and because of his sovereignty, he's going to hear us. He's going to do something. And then finally, it typically ends with a word of praise. We worship God even in the midst of our suffering. Here's the thing, though. Psalm 88 is different. Psalm 88 is a desperate, audacious prayer. Some people think that 2/3 of the Psalms are laments, Psalms of lament, but only 2 of them end with no resolve, no confidence in God, no worship, no praise at all. And Psalm 88 is one of them. The great Old Testament scholar Derek Kidner, he says that the Psalm 88 is the darkest psalm of all, right? So I wanted us to go, super dark, right? We're going all in, trying to figure out this lament. There's no resolve. It's the darkest of all, and yet God inspired it. God inspires this prayer. He inspires this song. God put it in the Bible for us to pray. Right? He gives us these prayers of lament, the prayer of Habakkuk, the prayer of Job, right? Jesus' prayer in the garden the night of his arrest, these psalms of lament. God gives us these prayers so that we would sing them, that we would pray them, because he is a loving father who knows how we speak when we're desperate. Look at me. He's a good dad who knows how you speak when you're desperate. And so he gives us permission to pray these psalms. And you'll notice in the title and the kind of heading of Psalm 88 that this is a song, right? A song, a psalm of the sons of Korah. And the worship leader is Haman the Ezrite, right? So he's the worship leader who sits down and writes this song for his congregation. I don't know if he was listening to too much Death Cab for Cutie or Radiohead or whatever, but he's depressed and he sits down and he gets at his desk and he lights a candle and he puts his skinny jeans on and he begins to write this song for his church, for his congregation, as the Holy Spirit inspires him to write. It's a song, and songs are meant for you to feel something, right? Songs take you on a tour of your heart, and they show you places in your heart that you don't typically go. It's this kind of tour, these words that take you to places that you don't typically go to so that you can feel what you don't normally feel. And he says in verse 1 and verse 2, this song of lament is directed, like all of them are, towards God. He starts off and he says, "O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you." This is personal. It's vulnerable, it's intimate. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. Like a mother knows the cry of a baby. Or you get a room full of babies and one will cry and the mom knows who the baby is. He's saying, like that, would you hear my cry? Are you listening to me? Right? He's asking God, do you hear me? Right? Will you listen to me? It's raw, it's audacious, it's honest. Right? He's not sure. Will God listen to me? And so this is a prayer filled with faith, even though it doesn't seem like it has the faith that we think that we're supposed to have when we pray these kinds of prayers. But faith at its least is a life directed towards God. And this is a prayer directed towards God. And so this is a prayer of faith, even though he's not sure if God's going to hear him. And in a prayer that seems hopeless, right, without resolve, we see there's actually a glimmer of hope in that opening line where he says, "The God of my salvation." This word salvation in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's a word that can get translated in different ways. In fact, it'll get translated often as healing. It can be translated deliverance. It can be translated rescue. So the psalmist is saying essentially this, that you are the God of my salvation. It's the word Yeshua. You are the God of my salvation, meaning you've done this before. You've saved me before. You've rescued me before. You've healed me before. You've done this before. Are you going to do it again? Right? Because it doesn't seem like you are, and this is terrible and painful. It doesn't seem like you're listening, but you've done it before. Will you do it again? So he prays this honest prayer directed to God, grieving, lamenting. It starts off directed to God, where we are going to be honest with him. Then he begins to communicate how he feels. God's giving us these words for our emotions. He's giving us permission to feel these things. In verse 3, he says, my soul is full of troubles. My heart hurts. It's filled up with grief. Right? This is complex, he's saying. This is complicated. Grief isn't linear. This isn't going to be easy. I don't even know what way is up right now. Right? There's the thing that I'm in pain over. There's this thing that happened, but then there's all these other things as well, and I don't even know how to make sense of all of it. My soul is full of troubles. Verse 4, he feels weak. I'm a man with no strength. Right? He doesn't want to get out of bed. He doesn't want to go to work. He doesn't want to be present with his kids. He doesn't want to do nothing. Verse 5, he feels abandoned by God. I feel like those you remember no more, like those that were cut off from you. In end of verse 8, he feels trapped. He says, I feel shut in. He can't escape. Verse 9, he uses this kind of imagery. My eye grows dim through sorrow. The eye is the source of light. It's your only source of light. And so what he's saying is, I'm virtually in darkness. There is no light. There is no hope. All I see is suffering and sadness and sorrow. It's expressing what he's feeling to God, and God's giving him these words so that we might feel those things, even if we don't know that we feel those things. He's communicating to God how he feels. And this is important. It doesn't even matter if he's right. It doesn't even matter if it's true. Right? The Bible isn't saying here that it's true that God has abandoned him. The Bible's not saying, in fact, the Bible is crystal clear all throughout the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation that he never leaves us or forsakes us. And yet, he gives us permission to say it feels like you've abandoned us. And he gives us this permission to communicate honestly to him. Now, most of us struggle to communicate our pain. If we do choose to talk about it, it's typically in lesser forms of communication, and it's typically to one another and not to God. Right? So it's not grief, it's other ways of, it's complaining, it's anger, it's sarcasm, it's outrage, it's gossip. Right? We're afraid or we're sad, and we don't know what to do with it, and so we communicate to others in lesser ways instead of grieving actually to God. And then many of us, we just kind of fall into the camp of we don't communicate our pain at all. We just stuff it. Right? Anyone want to testify? Are you a stuffer? Right? You just kind of take the pain, don't even really acknowledge it, and just, stuff it down and hope it eventually just goes away because we don't know how to navigate it. We don't even know what to do with it, and so we just push it down. My wife had a miscarriage a few years back. I've told you that story before. It plunged her into a years-long spiritual depression. But one of the things that she said that it did is it taught her how to lament. Right? Before that, she would pray. I mean, my wife can pray. She's on the prayer team. She's a prayer warrior in every sense of that word. And so before that, she would pray. She would go to God. She would ask God to fix it. She would go to God and ask him to do something about it. He's a divine power. He can move. He can act. He can do that. He can do something. But then she began to learn how to lament, where she would go to God, now not just to fix it, but in that moment, just what is she feeling? I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I'm sad, and she'll be able to go to God in that way because he's not just some distant deity, but he's a loving dad, and he knows how we speak when we're desperate. He knows what we feel. Do you censor yourself with God? You censor yourself with him. You process some things over here when you're mad or you're sad, and then you come to God and you say things that you think you're supposed to say. In the kids' version of the New City Catechism, question 38, it says, what is prayer? And all my kids, 11, 9, and 6, they'll be able to say, prayer is pouring out your hearts to God. Do you pour out your heart to God, or do you censor yourself with him? God puts this prayer in the Bible, and the Spirit inspires this song for us to sing because God is still your God and you are still His, not because you put on some happy face and say what you think He wants you to say. He's your God and you are His because of grace. And so you can come to Him, express how you feel, even if it's not even true, even if it's audacious, raw, honest, before Him. And so then the prayer moves into another common theme of laments, and this is where it gets really hard. In verse 6, he says, "You have put me in the depths of the pit." Verse 7, "Your wrath is heavy on me. You overwhelm me with all of your waves." We used to sing a song here called Satisfied in You. In the last verse, it says, "So when I am drowning out at sea, and all your breakers and all your waves crash down on me." God made the waves. He's saying, I'm drowning because of you. Verse 8, "You have caused my friends to shun me. You have made me a horror." So he's acknowledging, but also struggling with this idea of God's sovereignty, right? That God is in control, that He is over all things. That God is in control of all things, that nothing is outside of His control. He's struggling with this idea that this pain that he's enduring right now did not happen outside of God's ability to do something about it. So he's wrestling with that. He's acknowledging that, but he struggles with this idea. And yet, if there's a single event in all of the cosmos across all time and history where God isn't somehow involved, that God somehow isn't in control, then why would we pray? And He might not be able to do anything about it then, if it was outside of His control. Right? If one thing could happen and God couldn't do anything about it, then maybe He can't do anything about it the next time we need Him to do something about it. So why lament? Why pray? And why do we think He might deliver us? It's a struggle to think about the sovereignty of God in the midst of our pain. And yet, we are not deists at the Paradox Church. We are not those that think that there is a God, but this God created everything. He kind of wound the clock and then just bounced, right? And retired to Colorado or something and isn't involved anymore in the daily grief of His people. We don't believe that. We're also not open theists. Where you believe that God somehow doesn't have any sort of power. He's impotent to history just like you and I are. He can't actually enter in. He can't do anything about it. God doesn't even know what's going to happen next because He's at the whims of the desires of people just like you and me. We don't believe that at all. What we believe in is Jesus, who holds all things together, who upholds the universe by the word of His power. That's what we believe. That God is involved in every aspect and in control in every aspect. That God is orchestrating 10,000 things in your life right now. This symphony of joy and sorrow for His glory and our good. That's what we believe. When Job loses everything, he says, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, but blessed be the name of the Lord." Right, so all across the scriptures, from Genesis to Revelation, is this crystal clear reality that God is sovereign and in control over everything. And we have to wrestle with that. And yet, if it wasn't true, what kind of God would we be left with? If God wasn't in control of your evil and suffering and pain that you endure, does it comfort you to have a God who isn't? Does it comfort you at all? Are you comforted by Him if He is subject to the same whims of people as you are? If God is the victim just like you, does that bring you comfort at all? Can you worship a God like that? Would you pray to a God like that? Would you cry out to a God who is powerless just like you are? And so the psalmist, he knows that's not true. He's struggling with the truth of the sovereignty of God. He's wrestling with that because he knows it's true, but how can God be good and permit cancer? How could God be worthy of praise and allow miscarriages? Can God be trusted with our pain if He allowed it? And so he's wrestling with it. In fact, he just starts asking a bunch of questions, 6 questions, in fact. In verses 10, 11, and 12, he asks a bunch of questions, but it's really just one question. Why have you let this happen? Why did you let this happen? If you're to be worshiped, if my purpose is to bring you glory, how am I supposed to do that in the state that I'm in? Do the dead worship you? Do the depressed worship you? Do the distraught worship you? Do the despairing worship you? Right? Why aren't you doing anything? I struggle with this a lot. Like, I want the miracle. I want the big thing. I want the huge prayer answered. I think I've got a big God and I've got big faith. Like, I think he can do those things. I've seen him do those things, and I want him to do those things. Like, isn't God praised when the dead rise? Isn't God worshiped when the sick are healed? When his people prosper, isn't God glorified in all of that? And so I get frustrated when he's not doing that. Why aren't you doing anything? And I know the answer. I know the Bible answer, right? I know that God is working things out in our suffering. I know he's doing good work in it. I know that he works all things for the good for those who love him. I know that this is a light and momentary affliction compared to the eternal weight of glory that awaits us. But come on. Like, what sort of cosmic plan of God would have been foiled if he had given us a baby? What part of God's great plan would be hindered if you would finally get married? What possibly could have gone wrong in God's purposes if he would heal your sick mom? All that God is doing, couldn't he have figured out a different way to do whatever he was trying to do without it being so painful? So he's asking these questions. He's wrestling with these things. He says in verse 14, "Why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? Where are you? Why are you so distant? Here's what he's saying. Why did you let this happen? And then to compound my pain, you don't feel very near." My wife would have said that the miscarriage wasn't actually the worst thing. The worst thing was that she felt so alone. And then the psalmist, he ends his lament not with any resolve at all, but with words that are probably better translated, "Darkness has become my only friend." Darkness has become my only friend. It's an underhanded way of saying to God, and you are not. You are not there. You are not my friend. The only friend I have is darkness. He talks about the darkness 3 times here in verse 12 and in verse 6, because Christians may find themselves in darkness for a long time. The prayer ends with this: no resolve, just darkness. Meaning, you could be praying and praying and praying. You could be lamenting before God, grieving before God, looking to God for help. Listen, having faith. You could be having faith-filled prayers, asking God to move, asking him to do something, and still find yourself in the darkness. It's as if God is saying, if you're in the darkness, it might not be because you're doing something wrong. It might just be because I want you there for a little bit. And then it just ends. And so I don't want to try to tie this up in a neat bow. The text doesn't do it, and so I don't want to do it. I want to honor that and honor this moment. And so I don't want to try to resolve this at all. In fact, really what I just want us to do is to learn how to lament, and I want you to write a prayer of lament this week. But I do want to point out at least one thing. Back in verse 1, that glimmer of hope, where it says, "You are the God of my salvation." Right? That word save, yasha, right? Heal, deliver, rescue. That word is actually found in a different form in the Bible as well as a phrase or even a proper name. It says, I'm pronouncing all of these wrong, by the way, Yehoshua, which means God saves. Yah, save, rescue, heal. Yehoshua, God heals, God rescues, God saves. And Yehoshua, transliterated into English, is the name Joshua. The name is Joshua. It means God saves. But Yehoshua, transliterated into Latin, is the name Jesus. Our boy, our worship leader, he doesn't even know it, at least not exactly, but he's actually writing this song and singing it to Jesus, the God who saves, the God who rescues, the God who heals. And Jesus is going to come, and he's not going to give him all the answers to all of his questions, and he doesn't give us all the answers to our questions either. But what he does do is enter into our pain. Isaiah 53 says that he is going to be a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Surely he has borne our grief and carried our sorrows. In fact, Jesus even prayed the Psalms too on the cross. Right? Jesus prayed Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? On the cross, he prayed Psalm 31:5, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So check this, like on the cross, like the payment for your sin and the work that God did to shatter all that death had brought and sin had crushed, like all of that, like the work that brings all things broken back together on the cross. Jesus does that work, and it was made in the midst of prayerful tears as he prayed through the Psalms, as he lamented before God. And so we don't know why God allows all these things to happen that do. But what we do know is that he experienced pain, that he grieved too, that he suffered too, that he died too. But in his death dies, and one day suffering will be no more, and every tear will be wiped away, and we will grieve no more. And we can hope in that. I'll close with this, just this great paragraph from Tim Keller about how we grieve and how we rejoice in the midst of that grief, and how Jesus did too. He says this, rejoicing in suffering happens within the sorrow. The grief and sorrow drive you more into God. Yes, feel the grief. There's a tendency for us to say, I'm afraid of the grief. I'm afraid of the sorrow. I don't want to feel that way. I want to rejoice in the Lord. But look at Jesus. He was perfect, right? Yet he goes around crying all the time. He's always weeping, a man of sorrows. Do you know why? Because he is perfect. Because when you're not all absorbed in yourself, you can feel the sadness of the world. And therefore, what you actually have is that the joy of the Lord happens inside the sorrow. It doesn't come after the sorrow. It doesn't come after the uncontrollable weeping. The weeping drives you into the joy. It enhances the joy. And then the joy enables you to actually feel your grief without it sinking you. You find freedom from your pain. In other words, you are finally emotionally healthy.